They say every house holds memories, shadows of the lives that once called it home. But what happens when those shadows linger, watching, waiting? It started like any ordinary night. The streets were quiet, bathed in a dim, flickering glow from the streetlights. Inside, a clock ticked softly, marking the passage of time. A family, unaware of what lay ahead, settled in for the evening, a cup of tea on the kitchen table, the soft murmur of a television in the next room. A scene so familiar it could belong to anyone. But there was something about this house, something that made people stop and stare as they walked past. An unspoken weight in the air, heavy enough to silence even the most carefree conversations. For years, neighbors spoke in whispers, sharing tales of unexplained noises, strange lights in the windows, and the feeling, an unmistakable feeling, that they were being watched. Tonight, the truth will be revealed. The sound of footsteps echoing in an empty hallway, the creak of a door swinging open, though no one was there to move it. A breath, barely audible, brushing past like a cold wind on the back of the neck. These were the signs, warnings, if you will, but they went unnoticed by the family. You might think these are mere coincidences, tricks of the mind. After all, every old house makes noises, right? But what if it wasn't just the house? What if there was something else? Something waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Tonight, you'll hear a story that will make you question the safety of your own home. A tale of shadows, secrets, and the thin line between reality and the unknown. The house stood at the edge of the town, where the streetlights barely reached, and the roads turned to gravel. Its windows, clouded with years of neglect, caught the occasional glint of moonlight, giving the illusion of watchful eyes peering out from the darkness. The air here was colder, sharper. Every sound, every crunch of gravel underfoot, every whisper of the wind through the trees seemed amplified, as though the house itself were listening. For years, no one dared to live here. Some said it was the drafts, the mold, the way the foundation shifted ever so slightly when you walked across the floor. Others blamed the stories, tales of families who came and left without a word, as if the house had swallowed them whole. But then came the new tenants. Emma, a single mother, and her 7-year-old son, Lucas. They were looking for a fresh start, a quiet place where they could leave behind the noise of the city and the memories of a life they'd rather forget. The house was cheap, too cheap, but Emma, eager to rebuild, ignored the warnings, the glances from the townsfolk, the awkward silence when she mentioned the address. On their first night, the house seemed to welcome them with an unsettling calm. Lucas ran through the empty rooms, his laughter echoing off the bare walls, while Emma unpacked boxes in the dimly lit kitchen. The old light fixture buzzed faintly, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and shift along the cracked wallpaper. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and brushing branches against the roof. Lucas paused mid-step, staring down the dark hallway at the far end of the house. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "someone's standing there." Emma looked up, her heart quickening, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavier now, thicker. "It's just the shadows, honey," she said, forcing a smile, but her voice betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly. The night grew colder. In the living room, the ancient fireplace refused to light, though the wood was dry and the matches sparked easily. The walls groaned softly, as if settling into themselves, and the house seemed to breathe, inhale, exhale, with the rhythm of the wind. From Lucas's room came the sound of faint knocking. At first, Emma thought it was the wind again, but the pattern was too deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. She opened the door, finding Lucas sitting on his bed, his eyes wide and fixed on the closet. "It's just the house settling," Emma whispered, more to herself than to Lucas. She walked to the closet, her steps slow and deliberate, and opened it. The hinges squealed, the sound slicing through the stillness of the room. The closet was empty. And yet, for a brief moment, Emma thought she felt something, a presence, a heaviness that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She shook it off, closed the door, and tucked Lucas into bed. But as she turned off the light and left the room, she didn't notice the closet door slowly creaking open behind her. The first night passed without incident, or so it seemed. Morning came quietly, with the soft light of dawn streaming through the broken blinds. Emma tried to convince herself that the house was just old, its quirks explainable. She set about her day, unpacking boxes and cleaning, while Lucas played in the backyard under a gray, cloud-covered sky. But by the second night, the house began to speak. It started small, a faint tapping sound coming from the walls, rhythmic and deliberate. Emma sat up in bed, straining her ears. It was probably just the pipes, she thought, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the siding. But the sound moved, traveling from the corner of her room to the hallway, then to Lucas's room. She got up, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and followed the noise. "Lucas," she called softly, opening his door. The room was quiet, bathed in the pale blue light of his night lamp. Lucas was asleep, curled up with his blanket, but something caught her eye. A toy train, one she hadn't unpacked yet, sat neatly in the middle of the room. She hesitated. Had Lucas found it earlier, or had she forgotten unpacking it? Shrugging off the unease, Emma returned to her room and climbed back into bed. But as she drifted off, a sharp bang echoed through the house. She jolted awake, her heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time from downstairs. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to guide her through the darkened hallways. In the living room, she found the source of the noise. The front door, wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. The wind rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Emma closed the door, locking it firmly, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like unseen eyes following her every move. The third night was worse. Lucas refused to sleep in his room, claiming he didn't like the man who stood by the closet. Emma, desperate to comfort him, assured him it was just a shadow. But when she turned out the lights, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas wasn't entirely wrong. As she lay awake that night, the sounds grew louder. Faint whispers, the creak of floorboards, the tap, tap, tap from the walls. Then, just as she thought she might fall asleep, she heard it, a soft laugh, unmistakably human, coming from the kitchen. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The laugh came again, quiet and mocking. She sat up, clutching the edge of her blanket, and reached for her phone. Slowly, she crept down the hallway, her flashlight trembling in her hand. In the kitchen, the laughter stopped. The room was empty, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. But then she noticed it, the back door, unlocked and slightly ajar. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, and saw something written on the frosted glass of the door, a single word, traced in small, childlike handwriting. "Leave." She stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The sound reverberated through the house, waking Lucas. He stood at the edge of the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he asked sleepily. "Why were you talking to that man?" Emma's blood ran cold. "What man, Lucas?" she whispered. Lucas pointed toward the kitchen, his small hand shaking, the one standing by the door. But when Emma turned to look, the kitchen was empty. "What would you do if you saw this in your house? Would you stay, or would you leave everything behind? And what if leaving wasn't an option?" By the fourth night, the house was no longer just a house. Its presence was alive, pulsing with an energy that Emma could no longer ignore. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every sound carried a weight that made the silence unbearable. But it wasn't until the neighbor came knocking that Emma realized this wasn't just her imagination. Her name was Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She appeared at the door late that evening, her face pale and her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be here," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But you need to know, it doesn't like strangers." Emma frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "I can't explain it. Just don't stay in that house after dark." With that, she turned and hurried away, her cane clicking sharply against the sidewalk. Emma stood at the door, her unease growing. What had Mrs. Calloway meant? Why wouldn't she explain? That night, as Emma sat in the living room, flipping through an old photo album she'd found in the attic, she began to understand. The album was filled with faded photographs of children, dozens of them, posing in front of the house, their faces solemn, their eyes almost too dark, too empty. On the back of each photo was a date, spanning decades, but no names, no indication of who they were. One photo in particular caught her attention. A boy who looked eerily like Lucas, standing on the front steps, his hand resting on the shoulder of an unidentifiable figure blurred in the background. Suddenly, the lamp beside her flickered. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, leaning toward her. The heartbeat sound grew louder, pounding in her ears. Emma stood abruptly, clutching the photo album, and turned to see Lucas standing at the foot of the stairs, his face pale. "Mom?" he whispered. "I saw him again." "Saw who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The man in the mirror." Emma's stomach twisted. "What mirror?" Lucas pointed toward the hallway, where an old, cracked mirror hung on the wall. Emma approached it cautiously, her reflection flickering in the dim light. But then, in the corner of the mirror, she saw it, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her hands shaking, she took Lucas upstairs, locking his door and placing a chair against it. She needed answers, and the photo album wasn't enough. Returning to the attic, she searched frantically, her flashlight sweeping across boxes of forgotten belongings. That's when she found it. An old leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside was jagged and frantic, recounting the story of a family who had lived there decades earlier. They too had heard the whispers, seen the shadows. The last entry read, "We thought the scratches on the floor were from the furniture, but they weren't. They were from something trying to crawl out." Emma felt her blood run cold. She glanced down at the floorboards of the attic, noticing for the first time the deep gouges etched into the wood. As she leaned closer, the scratching sound began again. Soft at first, but growing louder, more frantic. The boards beneath her feet creaked, and the air around her seemed to thicken. Then, without warning, the trapdoor to the attic slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Trapped in the attic, Emma's flashlight flickered weakly, the beam bouncing off cobwebbed rafters and forgotten relics. The scratching sounds beneath her grew more insistent, more deliberate, as if something was clawing its way toward the surface. She pressed her ear to the floor, her pulse pounding in her ears, and that's when she heard it. A low, guttural voice, barely a whisper, repeating the same word over and over again. "Stay!" She recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time, she felt truly helpless, the weight of the house pressing down on her like a living, breathing thing. Then, the trapdoor creaked open on its own, revealing the hallway below. But the hallway was no longer empty. A figure stood at the far end, shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply watched. Emma's flashlight sputtered out, plunging her into darkness. She stumbled down the attic ladder, her hands shaking, her feet barely touching the steps. "Lucas!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She sprinted to his room, throwing the door open, only to find his bed empty. The chair she had wedged against the door was splintered, as if something had smashed through it. Panic gripped her. She turned, and there it was, the figure now closer, standing in the doorway. It didn't speak. It didn't move. Its presence alone was enough to suffocate her. Emma grabbed the diary she had found and held it up like a shield. "What do you want?" she cried. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her, before fading into the shadows. That's when she remembered the scratches. The diary's final words echoed in her mind. It was trying to crawl out. She raced downstairs, the air growing colder with every step, the walls seeming to close in around her. In the living room, the floorboards were buckling, splintering, as if something beneath them was alive, struggling to break free. Emma dropped to her knees, prying at the boards with her bare hands. Splinters cut into her fingers, but she didn't stop. Beneath the wood, she uncovered a hidden trapdoor, sealed with rusted nails. The scratching was deafening now, accompanied by faint, echoing cries, children's voices calling out for help. She hesitated, the hammer she had found trembling in her grip. Could she open it? Should she open it? Before she could decide, the trapdoor burst open on its own, flinging her backward. From the darkness below emerged a hand, withered, pale, and inhuman. It clawed at the edges of the opening, dragging itself into the dim light. The figure that followed was no longer a shadow. Its form was grotesque, twisted, a patchwork of features that didn't belong together. Its eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Emma. "You should have stayed," it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. Emma scrambled to her feet, running for the front door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The thing was faster than it looked, appearing in front of her in an instant. She turned and ran toward the kitchen, throwing chairs and whatever she could grab in its path. The house seemed alive now, doors slamming on their own, the walls vibrating with the sound of children's laughter and screams. Emma grabbed a butcher knife from the counter, holding it out in front of her, but the creature didn't flinch. It lunged, and she swung blindly. The knife passed through it as if it were smoke, and she fell to the floor. It loomed over her, reaching out with one long, twisted hand. "You opened the door," it whispered, "and now you can never leave." The room went dark. Emma's screams echoed into silence. When she woke, she was lying on the floor of the living room. The house was quiet again, the trapdoor sealed as if it had never been opened. Lucas stood nearby, staring at her with blank eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "why did you let it out?" Morning came with an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Emma sat on the living room floor, the diary still clutched in her trembling hands. The events of the night before replayed in her mind like fragments of a nightmare she couldn't piece together. But Lucas was safe. At least, that's what she told herself. He sat quietly on the couch, staring at the window. His blank expression unnerved her, but she pushed the thought aside. She had to get them out of the house. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "we're leaving." He didn't respond, didn't even blink. She packed a bag hastily, grabbing whatever she could find. The photo album, the diary, a handful of clothes. By the time she turned back to Lucas, he was standing at the doorway, his hand resting on the old mirror in the hallway. "Lucas, don't touch that," Emma said, her voice sharp with fear. He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unfamiliar. "It says we can't leave, Mom," he murmured. Emma froze. "What are you talking about?" Lucas pointed to the mirror. At first, she saw only their reflections, distorted and flickering in the faint light. But then, behind them, a figure emerged, a shadowy shape that grew clearer with each passing second. It was the same grotesque form she had seen the night before, but now it was smiling. She grabbed Lucas and bolted for the door, her heart pounding. This time, the door opened without resistance, and they stumbled out into the pale morning light. Emma didn't stop running until they were halfway down the street, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She glanced back at the house. The windows stared back, lifeless, as if nothing had ever happened. The silence of the neighborhood felt oppressive, as if everyone had turned a blind eye to their escape. But it wasn't over. That night, in the safety of a cheap motel room miles from the house, Emma felt the tension begin to lift. Lucas was asleep, his small frame curled up under a thin blanket. She sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot, the diary open in her lap. The last page, the one with the ominous warning about the scratches, had something new written on it. The ink was fresh, the handwriting shaky. "It follows." Emma slammed the diary shut, her hands trembling. She turned to check on Lucas, but the sight of his empty bed made her heart stop. "Lucas!" she called, her voice breaking. The bathroom door creaked open slowly. She approached it cautiously, her shadow stretching long across the floor. Inside, the mirror was fogged over, the faint outline of a handprint visible in the condensation. Behind her, the motel room door clicked open. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. Only the faintest whisper broke the silence. "You opened the door." Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some places never truly let you leave. Houses, like memories, hold on to the things we'd rather forget. And sometimes, those things hold on to us. Emma thought she was escaping. She thought the nightmare was behind her. But some horrors don't stay confined to the places we find them. They follow, they linger, they wait. And now, as you sit here, watching this, you have to wonder, what doors have you opened? What shadows are watching you right now? Tell me, what would you have done differently? Would you have stayed? Would you have run? Or would you have never gone through that door in the first place? Let me know in the comments below, if you're brave enough to share your thoughts. And if this story left you unsettled, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even closer to home.